April 1945, a munitions factory outside Erfurt, Thuringia. The spring air is heavy with the smell of coal smoke and wet earth. A column of American half-tracks rumbles to a halt before a set of wrought iron gates. The facility looks unremarkable from the outside, a standard complex of brick and steel. A man in a tailored wool suit steps forward from the gatehouse, smoothing his lapels. He holds a silver tray with a steaming pot of coffee and 2 porcelain cups. He smiles as if greeting honored guests at a garden party. He offers a drink to the lead officer. But behind the brick walls, 400 people are chained to their machines. They are living skeletons. In a small side room, 17 bodies are stacked like cordwood. The man with the coffee expects a polite conversation about industrial contracts. He is about to meet George S. Patton. This is what Patton did when a factory owner offered him coffee next to a room full of corpses. This is the story of how General George S. Patton confronted the owner of a munitions factory who treated mass murder as a simple business contract. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history. To understand this confrontation, we must first look at the 2 individuals whose lives collided at the factory gates. Anna Kowalczyk was 24 years old. She was born in the historic heart of Krakow, Poland, where her father had worked as a librarian and her mother had taught piano. In the spring of 1943, that life vanished. German soldiers arrived at her apartment door and gave her 10 minutes to pack a single bag. They did not take her to a camp. They took her to a machine. For 19 months, Anna lived within the gray walls of the factory. She had been a student of literature, but she became a biological component of a munitions line. She watched the girl at the station next to her collapse from typhus and never return. She watched the boy across the aisle lose 3 fingers to a hydraulic press and be dragged away while still screaming. Anna kept a mental ledger of every name and every face that disappeared into the room at the end of the hall. She survived on watery soup and the desperate hope that someone eventually would break the locks on the heavy iron doors. By the time the Americans arrived, she was a shadow of the woman who had left Krakow, her hands scarred by hot brass and her eyes hollow from the constant rhythm of the machines. Her Dietrich Langner was 56 years old. He was the 3rd generation of his family to run Langner Metallwerk, a business that had been the pride of the region since 1910. He wore a suit of fine charcoal wool, tailored in Berlin, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Langner viewed himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot and a pillar of industry. In 1942, he had personally traveled to the local SS headquarters to request a labor allocation. He did not see the Polish and Russian workers as people. He saw them as a line item on a balance sheet. He was a man of meticulous habits. He kept his office heated to exactly 20 degrees Celsius and decorated his desk with framed photographs of his 2 daughters at their confirmation. He believed that the rules of war were meant for soldiers, while the rules of business were meant for men like him. He felt entitled to his comfort and his profit. And he believed that as long as his production quotas were met, the method of achieving them was irrelevant to the world outside his gate. By April 1945, the Third Reich was a shattered shell, its borders collapsing inward as Allied steel ground its way toward the heart of Berlin. The Third Army was moving with a speed that defied traditional logistics, leaping across rivers and bypassing fortified cities to shatter what remained of German resistance. In the wake of this advance, American soldiers were stepping into a surreal landscape. On one hand, they saw picturesque villages where white flags hung from every window and terrified civilians offered bread. On the other, they were uncovering the industrial heart of a nightmare. The German government had long since abandoned any pretense of a professional workforce. As the war drained their manpower, they had turned to a massive, state-sponsored system of theft. The theft of human lives. Millions of people had been vacuumed out of Eastern Europe and forced into a network of factories that kept the Wehrmacht armed. These facilities were often hidden in plain sight, tucked away in quiet valleys or on the outskirts of unremarkable towns like Urfort. While many frontline officers were focused on the tactical map and the next bridgehead, they were increasingly forced to act as temporary governors, doctors, and investigators. Some commanders, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the displacement, simply moved past these sites, leaving the liberated workers to fend for themselves until the military government arrived. They treated the slave labor camps as a secondary problem to be solved after the final surrender. But as the infantry of the Third Army pushed into the Thuringian countryside, they realized that these factories were not just logistical hubs. They were crime scenes. The silence in the woods surrounding Erfurt was about to be broken by the sound of boots on factory floors. And the standard bureaucratic responses of the occupation were about to be replaced by something much more direct. The Americans were coming to realize that the war was no longer just about geography. It was about the things they found behind the locked doors. Captain James Miller, a 30-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, led the first platoon into the main production hall. He stopped at the threshold, his hand instinctively going to his pistol holster as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The smell hit him first. A mixture of lubricating oil, unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable copper tang of death. Down the long rows of heavy steel presses, he saw them, figures that barely looked human, their skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes wide and glassy. They did not stop working. The rhythmic clank and hiss of the machines continued because their wrists were fused to the iron frames by heavy steel shackles. Miller walked toward the nearest station where Anna Kowalczyk sat. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and she flinched so violently she nearly fell from her stool. The chain rattled, short and tight. Miller turned to see Herr Langner walking toward him, stepping carefully over a puddle of filth. "I must insist you do not disrupt the production line," Langner said. Miller looked at the man's polished boots, then back at the chained woman. "You have people shackled to machines," Miller said. "It is a security necessity for foreign labor," Langner replied, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "These are government contracts, high-priority munitions. If they do not work, the quotas are not met." Miller pointed toward the side room, where the door stood slightly ajar, revealing the pile of gray, emaciated limbs. "There are 17 dead bodies in that room, Langner." The owner shrugged slightly, as if discussing a minor clerical error. "The winter was difficult," he said. "Rations were diverted to the front. It is unfortunate, but efficiency requires certain sacrifices. They are merely units of production. I have treated them humanely within the constraints of the law." "You call this humane?" Miller asked, his voice rising. Langner straightened his tie. "I have offered you and your men coffee. I am a businessman, Captain. I follow the orders of the recognized government. I suggest you contact your superiors. You will find my paperwork is in perfect order." Miller looked at the skeletal faces watching him in terrified silence. He looked at the heavy padlocks on the chains. "This is far beyond my pay grade," he muttered to his sergeant. "Get on the radio. Tell them we have a mass casualty site and a civilian who thinks he's a host. Get the general down here." The report reached Patton within the hour. The distinctive roar of a multi-tone horn cut through the industrial hum of the factory yard. A mud-splattered jeep screeched to a halt at the main entrance, followed by a second vehicle bristling with machine guns. General George S. Patton stepped out before the wheels had even stopped turning. He was a vision of iron discipline in a place of rot. His helmet was polished to a mirror shine, the 4 silver stars catching the dim light. At his waist, the ivory grips of his revolvers rested against his hips. He did not look at the American officers who snapped to attention. He looked at the factory. He walked through the gate with a slow, predatory stride, his eyes scanning the filth and the finery of the man standing there. The air in the room seemed to vanish as he entered the production hall. He stopped 10 feet from the factory owner and waited. Patton gestured toward the line of machines with a gloved hand. "These are your employees, Herr Langner?" "They are labor units assigned by the state," the owner replied, clicking his heels slightly. "And they work 12 hours a day?" "That is the standard shift for wartime production, General." "Why are they chained to the equipment?" Langner adjusted his spectacles to prevent sabotage and unauthorized movement. "It is a security protocol." Patton's voice remained low and dangerously calm. "You told my captain you treated them humanely." "Show me where they eat." Langner blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time. "There is no central dining facility," he stammered. "They eat at their stations. It saves time." Patton looked at Anna Kowalczyk, then turned his gaze back to Langner. "You are a man of industry," he began. "You understand the value of a well-maintained machine. You keep your office warm. You keep your shoes clean. You sit in a padded chair 30 meters away from 17 rotting corpses that you didn't even have the decency to bury. You claim you were following contracts. You claim you were a businessman. But a businessman knows that when you destroy your tools, you are a failure. When you destroy human beings, you are a murderer. This young woman was taken from a home you couldn't imagine. She was a student, she was a person. You turned her into a bolt in your machine, and then you starved the bolt until it was ready to snap. You offered my men coffee while you stood on the bones of children. You think that because you have a suit and a ledger, you are different from the monsters in the SS. You are worse. They did it for a twisted faith. You did it for a profit margin. You have lived in comfort while they lived in hell. Now, the comfort is over. You will learn the true cost of your production. You have two choices. You can do exactly what I tell you, or I will let these 400 people decide what happens to you right now. Pick one. Langner looked at the hollow eyes of the prisoners and began to tremble. Patton did not wait for an answer. He signaled to the combat engineers standing by the door. Within seconds, the air was filled with the rhythmic snap of bolt cutters. One by one, the 400 workers were freed from their machine stations. The sound of heavy chains hitting the concrete floor echoed like a series of gunshots. Patton then turned his attention back to Langner. He ordered the factory owner to remove his fine wool jacket and roll up his sleeves. Under the watchful muzzles of American rifles, Langner was forced to walk to the army field kitchen outside. He was handed a heavy ladle and told to serve every single laborer he had starved. The survivors watched in stunned silence as the man who had treated them like scrap metal now trembled while filling their bowls. But the work was not finished. Patton pointed toward the side room. He ordered Langner to personally carry each of the 17 corpses from the factory to the town square of Erfurt. There would be no carts, there would be no help. Langner stumbled under the weight of the people he had killed, his polished shoes splashing through the mud of the street, while the townspeople were forced out of their homes to watch the procession of his shame. Finally, as the sun began to set, the engineers dragged Langner back to the factory. They led him to the exact station where Anna Kowalczyk had spent 19 months. They wrapped the cold steel chains around his wrists and snapped the padlock shut. He was left alone in the dark, chained to the machine he loved more than human life, to wait for the war crimes investigators. Anna Kowalczyk remained in a field hospital for 3 months as her body slowly relearned how to process solid food. She eventually returned to Poland but found her family home occupied by strangers and her parents gone. She moved to the United States in 1949 and settled in Chicago, where she worked as a translator for the court system. She lived a quiet, dignified life and died in 1998 at the age of 77. Those who knew her said she never sat with her back to a door and could never stand the sound of metal clinking against metal. To her last day, she carried a small photo of the American soldiers who had broken her chains, tucked safely inside her prayer book. Her Dietrich Langner was taken into custody by the Office of Strategic Services the morning after his night in the factory. He was tried during the subsequent denazification hearings in 1946. He argued that he was a victim of state circumstance and that his factory was a private enterprise under duress. The court was not moved. He served 8 years in a military prison before being released into a very different Germany. He spent his final years in a small apartment in Bonn, writing long, bitter letters to industrial boards claiming his pension had been unfairly calculated. He died in 1962, largely forgotten by the industry he once thought he commanded. Patton never mentioned the factory owner by name in his formal reports to Eisenhower, focusing instead on the logistical needs of the displaced persons. However, in a private diary entry dated 3 days after the event, he wrote about the smell of the machine shop. He noted that there is no greater sin than a man who uses the language of civilization to justify the acts of a barbarian. He told his aide that some men deserve a firing squad, but a man like Langner deserved to be forgotten while standing in the very filth he created. Some historians argue that Patton's brand of justice was unnecessarily theatrical and lacked the procedural rigor required by international law. They suggest that forcing a civilian to perform manual labor and public shaming bypassed the military justice system and bordered on a violation of the Geneva Convention's spirit. Others argue that in the face of such industrial-scale cruelty, traditional paperwork was a secondary concern to immediate moral reckoning. They contend that Patton's actions were the only effective way to force the local population to confront the crimes committed in their own backyards. What is certain is that the liberation of the Erfurt munitions factory served as a primary piece of evidence in the later Nuremberg trials, establishing a clear link between German industry and the machinery of mass murder. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the punishment to the formal courts? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.